Before we begin, I want to let you know that in this episode we talk about Canada's Indian residential schools. This episode contains descriptions of physical and sexual violence. If you're a survivor or an intergenerational survivor of residential schools, this may be especially difficult to hear. Please take care while listening. It's spring, the time of the budding moon. Norval is about 19 years old, and he becomes really sick with rheumatic fever. His grandparents are at his side. Norval is delirious, no longer recognizing anyone. A white doctor arrives. He tries to bring Norval's fever down, lays him in a bathtub with ice cut from the lake. Nothing helps. The doctor says all they can do is pray. Norval's grandfather, Potan, suggests getting a medicine woman, a woman named Agnes, who lives some 400 kilometers away. She arrives 2 days later. She lays out an eagle feather, some cedar, sage, tobacco, and sweetgrass. She crushes medicine for Norval to drink, and she prays in Anishinaabemowin. Agnes says she will enter the spirit world, to plead with the other-than-humans to heal Norval. She says if this doesn't work, Norval will probably die. In the spirit world, Agnes encounters the Thunderbird people, powerful bird-like beings. When she opens her eyes, Norval's fever has broken. And she gives him a new name, Copper Thunderbird.
It was a medicine woman from Indigenous, Ontario. And what I understood was that I was very sick when I was small, and she gave me this name. From then I got better. I was told it's a very powerful name, and those Indians that I have met, they were telling me that it's a very powerful name.
Years later, Norval wants to sign his new name on his paintings in a traditional way, but he doesn't know how. So he asks his wife Harriet.
My dad asked my mom Harriet, how do you spell my name in syllabics?
This is Norval Morrisseau, one of Norval's sons.
Ozawa Kubanes, what they call me. So my mom spelled it out in syllabics. So ever since then, that's what my dad wrote on every painting.
Harriet is Cree, and the syllabics she wrote out were in her language. She left her mark on Norval's work.
I think she had her own little impact on my dad's life, because of course they were married. They loved each other, you know what I mean?
Copper Thunderbird, Osawa Bigo Benese, an Anishinaabemowin word spelled out in Cree syllabics, the name that Norval signs on his paintings. Those syllabics were about as constant as anything could have been in the life of Norval Morrisseau. And as it turns out, how and where they were signed would provide a path to follow to the fakes. I'm Adrian Stimson. From CBC in Canada and ABC in Australia, this is Forged. Episode 2, The Signature.
I received a message from Kevin Hearn, and he was very concerned that he had been sold a fake painting by the Maslick McLeod Gallery.
This is Jonathan Summer. He's a lawyer with a specialization in art fraud.
I immediately was struck with his reasonableness. And that's not something you see a lot as a litigator. Often clients come to you and they're absolutely outraged at something that somebody else is doing, and they want that person destroyed, or, all these kinds of things. Kevin's approach to me was that he really wanted to know the truth.
Kevin reached out to Jonathan because he'd heard that Jonathan had worked on cases like this before.
When Kevin came to me, I already had a sense of the size of this fraud. This wasn't just some little scam that had happened to one or two people, but rather that it was much, much bigger than that.
So Jonathan takes on Kevin's case.
I wanted to work on it. It looked like a huge injustice, and if nothing else, then a huge mystery to be unraveled.
The first thing Jonathan set out to do was investigate the painting. Was it real? Where had it come from? In the art world, we call this provenance.
Provenance is tracing a path between the creation of the artwork by the artist and through all of the subsequent owners of that artwork. So what's the history of this work and how did it get from the artist to here?
And the provenance details of Kevin's painting, they weren't adding up.
When I bought the painting, Joe said that there was a fellow up in Thunder Bay who has had a collection of original Morrisseau paintings in storage since the 70s, and he's finally decided to sell them, and I'm very lucky.
Kevin says that story changed when he went back to Joe, after his paintings had been taken down from the AGO.
I said, okay, Joe, I need to know everything about this, and he gave me another list of provenance, and that one was different than the one before.
We investigated those and discovered that the people that were listed in them either didn't exist or they said, I never owned that artwork.
Jonathan and Kevin set out to authenticate the painting themselves, to try to piece together the real story of where it came from.
I mean, the goal of authenticating on the simplest level is to determine whether an artwork was produced by a specific artist or at least under the guidance of that artist. One thing we look for when we're looking for the authenticity of an artwork is we'll look at what are known as anachronistic materials. And this is where you look to see whether the painting that you're looking at used, for example, paints that didn't exist at the time that the painting was supposedly painted. There have been many fake paintings that have been caught that way. So Kevin's painting was dated 1974. That made no sense. In 1974, most of his works from that time period are done on mill paper, which was a type of paper that's brown. Canvas was a hard thing for him to come by. That's not to say he didn't ever paint on it, but it was more of a rare material. And this painting, Kevin's painting, is a very, quite a large painting. So it would have been a very unusual event for him to be doing that.
This painting of Kevin's, it was on canvas.
There's no record of him ever having painted this painting at that time. And the people that were around him at that time, including a couple of government workers who assisted him in obtaining materials, who assisted him in selling artworks and in communicating with galleries, those workers never saw this artwork. So it was just inconsistent with what he was doing at that time.
Just because it was inconsistent didn't necessarily mean the painting was a fake. To find out the truth, Kevin needed to uncover exactly what Norval was doing in 1974. But tracing Norval's life is kind of like watching a bird in flight. You follow it with your eye, see its path, but then you lose sight of it. It's out of view. Is it possible that Norval could have made Kevin's painting? Kevin was told that Norval painted Spirit Energy of Mother Earth in 1974. At that time, Norval is painting on whatever he can get his hands on: mill paper, wood, fridge doors, pizza boxes, birch bark, and sometimes even canvas, when he can get it. It's his most prolific period. Some say it's peak Norval. His paintings from this period, from the 70s, are so highly valued, they sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Kevin wanted to prove whether or not his painting was really one of those peak Norval pieces, and if so, where and when was it made?
I witnessed Norval painting with both hands, so 11-foot painting just knocked it right out. Doing the black outline with one hand and the color with the other. He might have partied or whatever in his life, but as an artist, this man was dead serious. And he liked to explore. He liked to explore his mind.
This is Joseph Sanchez. He's a painter and a curator, and he was a friend of Norval's.
I met Norval in the early 70s, hanging around Daphne's store. He would pop in. She sold prints of different Native artists. But the back of her gallery had this big warehouse, an empty space, and ultimately was called the Warehouse Gallery. So we just started hanging lots of work in there. We'd find ourselves in there just hanging out all day long, drinking coffee, talking about Picasso. Dishing on Picasso was one of our favorite things that we always did. Oh, he's not really a painter, obviously, you just go on and on. I could do that, He can't really paint.
Ironically, Norval Morrisseau was called the Picasso of the North. But back at the warehouse, they weren't just talking about Picasso. They were talking about their own art too. This group of artists were hanging out in Winnipeg in the 70s, when the Indigenous rights movement was really kicking off. And their art was a part of it.
So that kind of seeped into the idea of the group. Why don't we band together, cause a little trouble? The 70s was about having an attitude, standing up for what you believed in. And we did just that. We kind of broke down that glass ceiling that was keeping Indian artists out of the mainstream galleries.
We can't talk about Indigenous art in Canada, or anywhere really, without talking about this collective of 7 Indigenous artists. Joseph, Daphne Ojig, Alex Janvier, Jackson Beardy, Eddie Kobenis, Carl Ray, and Norval. These artists, they've all influenced me in my work. They called themselves the Professional Native Indian Artists Incorporated, and they became known as the Indian Group of 7. Joseph is the last living member of the group.
What I most remember about Norval is that he could be quite intimidating because he was tall, he was a big man, and he also was very quiet, but when he spoke with authority. So even in our meetings as a group, Norval would listen to what everybody had to say, and then he always had the final word. And it was usually the word that meant the most. He was like a guiding light in the group.
Norval would go out to Joseph's farm. About an hour outside of Winnipeg, he'd stay with him in his cabin and paint there.
My house was a bootlegger cabin, so it had a second floor, but there was no staircase. So my bedroom was upstairs, so I could put down the rope ladder, go up there and hide out and watch Norval perform below, because when he first got there, he was pretty wild. But he took 2 giant tubes of paint, squirted into his head, and would just run into the canvas. And he was just so intense. And then he'd calm down, and then he'd work on these paintings. I think he was suffering from hallucinations from drinking, because he would go through and he'd try to dry out. And my farm was really far away, 35 miles from Winnipeg. So there was no stores. You couldn't get liquor. You couldn't get anything. He wanted to come there because he just wanted to kind of get off the train, because he suffered really a lot in that way, that, from whether childhood experiences, residential school, all of that created, the stress. And you see that in a lot of Native people who suffered from the residential school. That experience for some was good, for a lot was horrible, and leaving scars that don't heal. And it just goes from generation to generation.
Norval grew up speaking Anishinaabe-Moan and learning traditional teachings from his grandfather, Moses Potan Nanakonegos, an Ojibwe shaman. When he was 6, Norval was forced to attend a residential school about 200 kilometers from his home. These government-sponsored religious schools tried to assimilate Indigenous children into Euro-Canadian culture. Abuse was rampant. I'm a residential school survivor. I know all too well the abuse of these places. Norval was there for 4 years. He was physically and sexually abused. He was beaten with a strap. forbidden from speaking his language, forbidden from hugging his own brother. He was forced into solitary confinement. He ran away from the school, 200 kilometers on foot, back to his grandparents, where he immersed himself in his grandfather's teachings and in painting.
You could see that in the beginning, he tried to be truthful to the legends. You know, he's a storyteller. He says that he's probably one of the last people alive that knows what those symbols mean. He was so dedicated to the work itself that nothing, no matter what condition he was in, he could always create the work. And that's inspiring.
Joseph says Norval would create his art, no matter what. And this brings us to Kevin's painting. Because one of the stories Kevin was told was that Norval painted it in jail. Throughout the 70s, Norval was in and out of prison. We can't really know what was going on for Norval at that time, why he didn't stay in one place. But we know how trauma operates, how it courses through a person. And we know that the horrors of residential school clung to Norval. We know that he struggled with alcohol and drugs. At one point, his wife Harriet charged him with desertion for leaving her and their kids, and he's locked up for lack of family support. Norval ends up in jail, many times, for public intoxication. As I've been following Norval's story, this part of his life shows up again and again in the media. In an interview in 1975, Norval said, "I am tired of hearing about Norval the drunkard, Norval with the hangover, Norval in jail. They speak about this tortured man, Norval Morriseau. I'm not tortured. The only reason I'm talking about this now is because of what he did in jail. He made art."
I think it was the early 1970s, while he was incarcerated in a Northern Ontario jail.
This is Gerald McMaster again, the curator who thought Kevin's painting was questionable.
So while in jail, he, of course, did drawings. I mean, that's what you do when you're an artist.
Gerald got really familiar with some of the art Norval created when he was in jail. He curated an entire exhibit of these works, called them the Prison Series.
The drawings themselves were quite fascinating. They were really about that spirit world that he knew best. He called the painting elsewhere a separate reality, and I feel the same thing, that he was always picturing this separate reality, a reality that only people who go on vision quests and are engaged in the communication of another world, a phenomenological world, a supernatural world that we no longer engage with, that we just don't understand. So the drawings, they're a mix of humans and animals and plants, sometimes in transformational moments, and where a human turns into an animal and vice versa, where it's in underwater or in some other worlds. And that was his world, and that's why he was so brilliant to try and to represent that world for us to try and understand.
Kevin was told his painting came from this prison period.
He allegedly painted a bunch of paintings, which then were acquired by a jail guard named Dieter Voss, and that ultimately came into the possession of a guy named David Voss.
We proved that to be false. There was no guard there named Voss. Who was there was a guy named Bob Fox, who I went to meet, and he was friends with Norval and had been the person supplying him with art supplies while he was painting in the jail. And he saw my painting and just shook his head. He said, "That is not what he was painting in there." And the year of my painting is the same year that he was in the jail.
There's no consistent set of records that absolutely documents all of his output. He had a lot of chaotic aspects to his life. He struggled with alcohol addiction, and so there were periods in his life when he would, go on a bender, and it wasn't clear what he was doing. Was he painting? Was he not painting? If he was, what was happening to the artworks that he was doing? So there's these kind of gaps, which for a fraudster is opportunity to fake. If I'm a fraudster and I'm looking for an artist's works to copy or make in the style of versions of, what are you going to look for? And the first thing that I would say is you look for an artist who had a life that had a lot of chaos in it.
This chaos in Norval's life might have been the perfect cover. And it might have made this search for the truth about Kevin's painting impossible. But there was something about the painting itself.
The paint color on a Norval Morriseau painting. He tended to paint using paints right out of the tubes and did not dilute them with titanium white, for example, which gives a slightly milky, aged appearance. So his colors tend to be very primary and concentrated. Kevin's painting, Spirit Energy of Mother Earth, there were a number of sort of features of it that stand out as problematic. When you look at the overall composition of it, it's almost more like wallpaper, where all the elements are kind of arranged all over the image, with no clear center of focus. That would be very unusual. It was not generally the way he would do things. He had a bit more of a classic approach to composition that focuses on a central figure or a focal point. The other thing is the color on that painting. So first of all, it has that muddy quality, which indicates that there was the addition of titanium white to the paint, which was definitely not something that Norval did. And the color scheme has a lot of green and sort of grays, and there are these kind of muted tones that all exist in one sort of spectrum of color and luminosity, which produces a result that's attractive aesthetically, but it is really not consistent with Norval's normal way of painting artworks.
And there's one more thing. On the back of Kevin's painting, on this tan-colored canvas, there's this faded-looking black paint.
A faded Norval Morrisseau signature in black dry brush paint. And then there's the drawing of the Thunderbird and then a little copyright symbol.
That Thunderbird on the back of the canvas, Kevin says it's something Joe talked about when he bought his painting.
He showed me the back of the painting, and there was a little drawing of a Thunderbird, and Joe McLeod said whenever Norval really liked one of his paintings, he'd draw this Thunderbird on the back. And that was also a red flag, because eventually we looked at all the collections of Morrisseau works across the country in the art museums, and none of them had a Thunderbird drawn on the back.
The authenticated Morrisseaus also didn't have this black dry brush paint.
And when I say black dry brush signature, it's a signature that says either Norval Morriseau or N. Morriseau. It's done in black dry brush, which is where black paint is on a brush, but the paint has been allowed to dry a bit, so it has a slightly chalky, broken up appearance. And there'll be that signature. There'll often be a title, sometimes a copyright symbol, a date, and then occasionally there'll be a little icon, sometimes like a Thunderbird or something like that. Norval almost never did anything with black paint on the back of a painting. Certainly none of the major works that the public may be familiar with, there's nothing on the backs of these paintings. But there's always the possibility that he did this once, twice, 3 times, I don't know. So you can't just definitively say a painting is fake because you see a black dry brush signature. But to me, it would be a very, very important sign that it probably is a fake.
I asked Joseph Sanchez about this, because he was around Norval when he painted in the 70s, saw him sign his canvases. Do you ever remember him signing the back of his paintings, or was just the front?
I never saw him sign the back of a painting. So, and never dry brush like that, you know. He liked the loaded brush. And never was a wimpy, tentative stroke.
Kevin's painting has all these signs that Norval didn't paint it. It's inconsistent with his work, with what he was doing at the time. No one saw him paint it. But to prove without a doubt that he didn't paint it, Kevin needed to find out who did. Because if it wasn't Norval signing that painting, then who was?
Gary was creepy. I didn't like serving Gary. But he was a customer. He used to come to the store quite often and buy a lot of paint, a lot of canvas. He would send people to pick things up. I'd get scared when I realized how horrible some of these people are. Yeah, like it just, I was scared.
That's on the next episode of Forged. Forged is a co-production of CBC in Canada and ABC in Australia. It was produced by Kyle Musica and showrunner Zoe Tennant. Our contributing reporter is Luke Rinaldi. Additional production support from Rudy Bremer and Anna Marie Harding. Our contributing editor is Phelan Johnson, and our senior producer and story editor is Veronica Simmons. Sound design and original music by Graham MacDonald. Emily Metu is our fact-checker. Roshni Nair is our coordinating producer. At CBC Podcasts, executive producers are Cecil Fernandez and Chris Oak. Tanya Springer is the senior manager, and Arif Nurani is director. Special thanks to the CBC Indigenous office. At ABC, Calric Martin and Jessica Radburn are executive producers.